Hello and welcome. It is your weekly program that has always been concerned with the virtual gathering. That is the gathering that occurs on air and online. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, thanks for your time. In our last program, we concluded our journey in the parish of St. Philip for 2020 by looking at the Lighthouse, Bayfield and surrounding communities. We have now moved along the eastern coastline of Barbados to the parish of St. Andrew, where we are about to begin a journey of 5 weeks. That journey begins in a community that is synonymous with the parish, Chalky Mount. Many over the years have used various descriptive terms when referring to Chalky Mount. Patrick Yearwood grew up here. Let us see how he describes his community.
In my estimation, the most beautiful district in the whole of Barbados, Chalky Mount. Chalky Mount for me holds many fond memories. I remember growing up in Chalky Mount in the 70s and the 80s, and as you can see, it's still a very beautiful area.
Of course, Chalky Mount was, and I think still is, an agriculturally based community. When I came up, most of our parents and grandparents worked in the surrounding plantations. You had Bizix, you had Cambridge, you had Seniors Plantation, and of course you had Haggards. And added to that, you had two sugar factories in very close proximity to each other. There was Haggards, but a little further up the road you had Bruceville Sugar Factory, and of course I can recall those functioning in certainly my early days. So those drew not only persons who were planters from St. Andrew, but from St. Thomas and St. Joseph as well.
My mother, along with many of the other individuals in the area, worked on those plantations. They would cut cane, they would load cane, because back then there were no loaders, so everything was done manually. And I remember my brothers and I and countless other young people having to, at midday, take food. Sometimes they had to walk as far as a mile and a half in the hot midday sun with that morbi and that lemonade and that good old ground food to take to our parents. And those were some wonderful times. Apart from working the plantations, there were many individuals who had their own cane, on their land. And many of us at times would have to work in the field assisting our parents in loading those canes onto the trucks. There were no trailers back then, just normal cane trucks. And those were hard times, yes, but they were also very much enjoyable.
When the older people, when they're growing the crops and sugar cane and thing, I used to go and help them cut canes or head the canes. And we used to have the heads of canes on steep hills, some long cat roads. You know what I mean? But it was fun time. We used to race heading canes then. And when we heading canes, we ain't going home. We stopping in the field, we can work, and the old people can feed we, and we can sit down there and relax, and then we can get up and work again. And when all the canes done, everything done. We ain't working until like 4 o'clock and thing. As long as quick as we can do it, it's done, and we good.
And in all season, they would plant ground food, potatoes and yams. Those were days when you get a rod of potato for what, $5, $10? And a rod of potatoes back then was a rod of potatoes. And when a person brought home a big bag of potatoes, they shared everything with the neighbors. And one thing I think that is missing from society, but I hope it still happens in Chalky Mount, is that people would share. So when your mother sent you to the neighbor to give her 2 potatoes, you cannot come back home without a breadfruit or a yam. People shared.
And of course, like the typical country boy, actually was talking to my sister, we were recalling the fact that your parents put you through a lot of work. But certainly that has served us well, because, well, I went to the Allen School, and the truth is, you largely had to walk to school. It was a few miles away from Chalky Mount. But before you did that, you had a task on mornings to take your animals, cows, sheep, goats, whatever, sometimes 2-3 miles to seniors, you know, and then knowing that, but the journey back meant you came back with meat on your head. And the truth is, I made a joke with her and said, no reason my neck is so short, man, because the truth is, your father would put this meat on your head, and the thing was so heavy, you were too ashamed to say that it's too heavy. And by the time you get home, you can move your neck for a few hours, you know? But it was the discipline, though, that discipline. And then you had to do the same thing on evenings, you know? The truth is, I was a fairly decent child, but most of the trouble I got into had to do with playing cricket. Playing cricket late at school, they get in for the sheep late, you know, that kind of stuff. Talking about agriculture, the truth is, people were generally not well off, but I wouldn't say we were poor. You never went hungry, because most persons had at least a half acre of land or a full acre. In between those canes, you had your potatoes, your yams, your eddas, you know. And then outside of the harvest season, it was the manure, whether artificial manure or the manure from the cow pens, you know. So the truth is, I tell people, I may look soft, but I came up working real hard. And you know that is so for the average country person.
Additionally, Chalky Mount was and still is to some extent an area where sheep and other livestock were reared, but mainly sheep and cows. And I remember the old gentlemen like Kelmans and others would come down the road and they would bring these sheep, and almost everybody kept sheep. They would take them into pasture to graze, and in evening time they would bring them back home. I'll tell you one thing that stood out. My brother, I had a brother, he kept sheep, but he had a certain billy. He would train that billy to fight. And boy, let me tell you something, even myself and my brothers were afraid to go to get this billy. So when we go to collect the sheep, we would have to loose this billy last, because you know what? It used to butt us. And one time that billy butt me, I tell you no lie, it picked me up and it knocked me about 4 feet. And I remember one time there was a local village butcher called Mr. Frankie Vaughan, and they would use a shot for the killing of animals. And I remember one time I saw that same billy that used to butt us and cause us so much consternation being butchered. And I said, I was so happy. That was the interview. I said, no more butting days. And I'm serious about that. You know, I said, no more butting days. Because that billy used to terrorize the district. In fact, when other gentlemen bring their sheep, they would bring their billies to fight against my brother's billy. But there was only one winner. He always won. And so those were some fun days that we had in Chalky Mount. But I remember my mother had cows, and my mother has a lot of land, so we have a gully. And I remember one day, the year was 1996. Now, my mother got a cow from her father. This cow week was considered wild. None of us could really get this cow control. And one day I went for the cow, and I decided, well, I'm going to control the cow. But the cow controlled me. You know, when that cow started to chase me, I had to run for my life. You understand what I'm saying? I think the cow actually almost caught me and knocked me down. Yeah, but you know, back then it was no fun. But you know, now you look back at it, you can laugh.
But talking about the animals, that leads me into the whole question of backyard slaughtering. Because the truth is, I mean, while I love the pigtail, because you know, again, as boys, you had to be there when our main butcher in the community was a man called Edward Boyce. You know, he had all the facilities, including this stage. This stage was a big iron thing, which you heated, you know. When you kill the pig, you would put the carcass in the hot boiling water, I suppose, to soften the hair, and then you would shave it, right? And my role, or the role of the children, was you had to help hold down the feet of the animals, or you would have the container there catching after the throat is slit, you know, you have the container there to catch the blood. In those days, some of that blood was used to mix in the mixture, potato mixture for the pudding sauce. You know, I shared that with some students in the past, and they could not believe it. In fact, some of them did not even know that the pudding in the skin was really the intestines of the pig. And some said, I'm not eating that again. But that was community life. That was the average life in Chalky Mount, backyard slaughtering. So you came and eating, as we would say, belly and rice, ear and all kinds of things you ate.
With butcher shops in the community, the eating of various parts of the animals, no doubt, would be part of the community's culture. What about family names, relations, and identities?
One thing I must say about Chalkmount back in those days, especially in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, was that it was, and I believe it still is, a very close-knit community. In fact, they tell me most of the people in Chalkmount are related. You have the Greens, the Kelmans, the Marshalls, the Springers, the Combatches, the Athleys, the Devonishes, the Wilkies, just to name a few. And if you had to ask around, the majority of folk in Chalkmount are related.
In fact, that was so when it came up. Of course, over the years, you would have had some persons moving into the community, but I still think that largely their persons are still related.
A community of families and relatives. You could not speak about Chalky Mount without making mention of a building that once stood on this site for many years. It was more than a building. It was an institution that gave character to the community of Chalky Mount.
That school is historic, and it has produced some fantastic people. In fact, free from bias, I remember when I was going to school, that school was known as the primary school with one of the best staff in the island. And you're talking about persons of the ilk of Margarita Williams, who was my first teacher, I should say, and my Cub Scout mistress. She started to teach at age 16. When she retired from teaching service, she was the principal of the school in Government Hill Primary School, Charles F. Broome. Excellent teacher, to my mind the best teacher. You had Mr. Goodridge, you had Miss McLean from Coffee Gully. I mean, top-notch teachers. We had some excellent head teachers as well, but to my mind, the one that stood out was Mr. Roach, Frederick Roach, Reverend Frederick Roach. I'll tell you why he stood out. When he came to Chalkmount, he initiated some fantastic things. You're talking about extracurricular activities. We ended up with the best scout troop in Barbados. I'm not ashamed to say that. I mean, you can challenge it, but that's all right. The best scout troop in Barbados. We had one of the best 4-H clubs in Barbados. Very active Brownies. Very active Cub Scout movement. And he was one who felt that despite the fact that we have limited resources in terms of even playing field, which we'll talk about a little later.
I remember my days at Chalky Mount, and there are two of my teachers that stand out. The late Miss Hazel Marshall, an excellent English teacher, excellent role model, and Miss Beryl Dean, the principal of the school at that time, a strict disciplinarian, but at the same time a very wonderful role model as well. And you know, I remember those days when Miss Beryl Dean was principal, when we were in the hall getting ready for assembly and we were noisy. From the time we heard Miss Beryl Dean's footsteps on the corridor, the whole school went quiet. Hearing those footsteps meant silence. And as I reflect upon my time at Chalky Mount, I remember my first teaching appointment was at the said Chalky Mount Primary School. I remember Miss Beryl Dean took me into class 4, and she told me, Mr. Hayward, welcome back to your old school. And she said to me, look, you may be now a teacher, but you still have to practice. And she took me on the board, and I had to practice writing. In those days, we had to do what you call cursive writing. I had to spend countless hours just practicing that. And finally, she told me, well, now you have it, you can go and teach. So I had so many wonderful experiences at Chalky Mount Primary School. We spent time, you know, playing. The facilities at Chalky Mount Primary School in terms of sporting were not the best, but we made the best of what we had in terms of the facilities. So there were some very wonderful days at this primary school.
It's amazing the high level cricket we played on that 2x3. That's what Chalky Mount was, a 2x3. You know how the fast ball used to bowl? You used to go up in the hill and start, run across the road, and then you had just a few meters between the road and the stumps. And, I mean, we played some incredible cricket there.
This was what we used for cricket bat. This was our cricket bat. You know, we didn't have any fancy bat. This is what we used. So many of us came up trying to be a Gordon Greenidge. Gordon Greenidge is my favorite cricketer. Sir Gareth Sobers. And we would use, we used what we had. This came from the coconut limb. You would cut out the coconut limb, preferably somewhat drier, and you would carve out the bat, and we played cricket in the road. And we had wonderful times playing cricket. So even though we did not have a lot of facilities, we made sure that we had fun. The young boys, young girls all played together. We had females, males playing cricket in the road, and we had some wonderful times in Chalky Mount. But yet, in spite of all these lack of proper infrastructure, Chalky Mount was still able to produce some great sportsmen and women. One outstanding sports personality that came from Chalky Mount was my niece, who represented Barbados in volleyball for many years, Miss Sharon Bovell. So we did produce our fair share of sportsmen and our fair share of sportswomen.
I remember one year, it was customary for us to go down by playing cricket pasta for our own sports. Mr. Rook said, no, that's not happening. We're going to have our sports. So I suppose he would have communicated with the relative authorities, and we had sports in the road, 100 meters, 800 meters, all sorts of things. Straight road, 100 meters, straight road, you know? And people bought into that, right? Because what he was trying to do is to develop self-confidence, self-reliance, and try to suggest to us that, look, we are as good as anybody else. And I think it worked very, very, very well. He was very, very highly respected. And the truth is, he didn't use the Skylark. Once I saw him run a student. He ran in with his track, Tommy Burns. The guy was rude to him. He told him come, he wouldn't come. He started to run home. He said, you running? He ran in down to the door. While the guy was trying to get into the door was licks, you know. But he was an exceptional headmaster.
From the school, let us take into consideration commercial activities in the community of Chalky Mount, buying, selling, places where community members could purchase groceries and other items.
The area had many shops, but the main shop in Chalky Mount was owned and operated by a man named Mr. Louis Waldron. Now, Mr. Waldron was also a very trustworthy, well-known figure in the area. In those days, when parents were not able to purchase things cash, they were able to credit. And at the end of the week or the month, we could go and pay Mr. Waldron what we owed. Our parents would send us to pay him. One thing I remember, though, is that whenever my mother sent me to the shop, and when Mr. Waldron totaled up the bill, I would tell him, Mr. Waldron, don't worry, you owe me 10 cents back. And before we even check in, he would just give me back the change. Such was the nature of trust and relationship amongst us here in Chalky Mount. As I said to you, Chalky Mount is one of the most beautiful districts in Barbados. And many of the folk back then made their living in three main ways. One, through pottery. Some of the famous potteries back then were Mr. Devenish. You think about the Hardins. You had the Greens, the Springers, just to name a few, the Kellermans. These were some of the most famous potters in Chalky Mount.
When I came up as a boy, you had no less about 10 active potters, stretching from the top of the district to the bottom. You had people like Granville Kelman, Summer Hardin, Adolphus Cummins, Mr. Blackett. Mr. Blackett, who is related, the Blackett's related to Monsignor Blackett. Mr. Goodman, Mr. Devenish, several of them, but the most famous of them all was Mr. Hardin. Actually, about 2 years ago, someone had on their Facebook page a picture of this potter. And she got it from somewhere. And she was saying, well, I don't know who the potter is, but obviously from Chalky Mount, I knew Mr. Hardin. So I was able to respond and say to her, well, no, it's not just any potter, it's the famous Mr. Hardin out of the bowels of Chalky Mount. And these guys were exceptional. I spent many hours watching Mr. Hardin perfect his craft.
And up to this day, some of these individuals or their family are still carrying on the pottery tradition.
My father used to make pottery at Blackhead with his sister. You understand, up underneath a cellar. And sometimes I would go there and watch them make pottery, and then so they push the wheel. You know what I mean? Not only with he, but all the old potters in Chalky Mount used to go and help them push the wheel and that kind of thing, right?
And even now, when I have friends who may be visiting, as long as the schedule permits, I would take them to Chalky Mount. Because to my mind, there is something incredible about seeing the potter at work. And if you're familiar with the process, you know, taking that, what appears to be that rough, crude material from the bowels of the earth, and then refining it, and then seeing the potter use his hands and crafting that material into a beautiful vessel, I mean, it's fantastic. And of course, you know, there's a biblical thing there as well, because God says that he is the what? He is the potter, and we are in the clay. I remember as a boy, my grandmother was a vendor, a pottery vendor, if you put it that way. And the truth is, she would actually literally walk from Chalky Mount to the West Coast. I don't know how she did it, but that's what she did. She would walk, and sometimes my big sister would, who lives in the States would accompany her, and she too had to have some on her head. But they would walk from Chalky Mount to the West Coast, going from hotel to hotel with a whole tray of potteries, monkeys, corneries, the whole works on their head.
That was some walking indeed. But when you take pride in what you have produced, you would go to any length to share that with others. In addition to pottery, Chalky Mount was known for another major cottage industry.
The one that most stands out, that I find very synonymous with the Chalky Mount area, is basketry and craft. Many of the individuals back then earned their living by plaiting baskets. Now, I remember in those days we had to sometimes walk miles, go out in St. Joseph, St. John to get what some people may call cane lily. But we in Chalky Mount call them penguin. Yes, penguin. That was the local name for them, and still is the local name. The penguin would be picked when they were dry, a brownish in color. And people would weave and plait the baskets, and you put on something called raffia. I don't think people know a lot about raffia today, but back then we would weave the raffia into different patterns and make butterflies and flowers. And now, as you can see in my hand, is a basket. This was some of the work that was done by many of the individuals in Chalky Mount, made of what we locals refer to as penguin. We didn't call it cane lily. We call him penguin. And this is the dry penguin. And here you have something called a root. We would also pick the root of the tree. We would put that to dry, strip it down. And now I was not good at these. My mother and others in the village were good at these. But you can make these sort of baskets, and they were used, many churches use them. People use them to put fruit basket, gift baskets, you know, for decorative purposes and stuff like that. So these were some things that were made by many of the individuals back then who lived in Chalky Mount as part of raising income. I remember often on Friday morning, the buses were filled with people who would take down those baskets down to the handicraft center right there in Pelican Village. It was a norm. Almost every individual in the village would take the baskets down to Pelican Village. Apart from baskets, the coconut tree, we would take the dry coconut limb, we would cut off the coconut leaves, and we would put together those bones in a nice, neat package. And those would also be taken down to the handicraft center for money. And that's how we made lots of our money.
Responding creatively to your environment and the world around you, something that should be taught to our youth today. Looking around you and making good use of the available resources in the creation of a product that is in demand by others. One of the main subjects of interest in these communities is transportation. What was it like back then?
Transportation back then was obviously not like it is now. Before I talk about the buses, I mean, there were very few people in town who had cars. And whenever someone wanted a bottle of gas, there were about 1 or 2 people who had carriers. And Mr. Rudder would have been one of those persons with a carrier, the late Chester Rudder. If a person was pregnant and they had to get to the hospital, you had to call Mr. Rudder, I think, or Mr. Boyce from down Chalky Mount to transport you down there. And they often did it at a very minimal fee or free, because such was the camaraderie and the neighborly love in Chalky Mount. Now, back in the 70s and early 80s, there were no transport buses. I said, in this area of Chalky Mount, we were serviced by the Elite Bus Company. The buses were blue, you know, the open buses, they were blue in color. But if you did not get the Elite bus, you had to walk down Coggins Hill and catch the Rockland bus, which was based in St. Andrew and owned by a lady called Miss Rock. Obviously, because of the open nature of the buses, when a child got on a bus, the adults would put you on the inside to make sure that you're safe. Because if you ever fell asleep in those buses, you know, it could be very dangerous for you. And that might be the end of you. So the adults would be very, very, very responsible. And many times they would put us as children on the inside of the buses and they would take the outside part. But transportation, as I said, was not the best, but we may do what we have, and the few people who had carriers will look out for one another.
Absolutely wonderful. There is an important lesson in that for all of us. They made do with what they had, and the few who own cars look out for the others. This is who we are. A special thank you to the Reverend Jewel Cumberbatch and to Patrick Yearwood. Until next week at the same time, I'm Sherwood McCaskey. It's goodbye for now.